"You look cold, Mister." The evening snow fell gently on Maple Street, each flake catching the warm glow of the old-fashioned street lamps. The cobblestone path sparkled under a thin blanket of white, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Shop windows cast golden rectangles of light onto the sidewalk, where a few late shoppers hurried past with their coat collars turned up against the cold. On the corner near the old bookstore, a man sat alone on the stone steps. His name was David, and he wore a dark wool coat that had seen better days. His hands were tucked deep in his pockets, and his breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour, watching people pass by, without really seeing them. David had nowhere else to go tonight. The small apartment he had called home for 3 years was no longer his. The eviction notice had been posted that morning, and by afternoon, his few belongings sat in boxes on the curb. He had enough money in his wallet for maybe 2 nights, at the cheapest motel across town. But after that, he wasn't sure what would come next. The weight of his situation pressed down on him like the cold itself. At 42, he had never imagined he would find himself homeless. The factory where he had worked for 15 years had closed 6 months ago. Despite sending out dozens of applications and attending every job fair in the county, nothing had worked out. His savings had slowly disappeared, first to rent, then to groceries, then to nothing at all. As he sat there, David noticed movement in the shadows near the alley beside the bookstore. A small figure emerged, moving carefully through the snow. It was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with long brown hair that fell in waves around her shoulders. She wore a thin sweater that looked far too light for the weather, and her feet were bare except for worn canvas shoes. The young woman carried a large tattered blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Despite her own obvious need for warmth, she moved with purpose toward David. Her steps were quiet on the snowy stones, and when she reached him, she stopped just a few feet away. "You look cold, mister," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can use my blanket." David looked up at her, startled. Her face was gentle, with kind eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than her years suggested. He could see that she was shivering slightly, yet she was offering him the very thing that was keeping her warm. "Oh, no," David said quickly, shaking his head. "I couldn't take that from you. You need it more than I do." The young woman smiled, a warm expression that seemed to push back the cold around them. "My name is Sarah," she said, "and I think we both need it about the same amount." She sat down beside him on the step, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. Then, without waiting for his permission, she unfolded the blanket and draped half of it over his shoulders while keeping the other half around herself. "There," Sarah said with satisfaction. "Now we can both stay warm." David felt the immediate relief of the shared warmth, but more than that, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: human kindness without expectation. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'm David." They sat together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the snow continue to fall. The street was growing quieter as the evening deepened, and the warm light from the shops created a peaceful atmosphere around them. "I've been watching you sit here," Sarah said eventually. "You have that look." "What look?" David asked. "The look of someone who's trying to figure out where to go next," she replied. "I know it well." David studied her profile in the lamplight. Despite her youth, there was something weathered about her, something that spoke of hard experience. "How long have you been ... he began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the question politely. "On the streets." "About 8 months now," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "Lost my job at the diner when they closed down. Couldn't make rent. You know how it goes." David nodded. He did know how it went, all too well. "But here's what I've learned," Sarah continued, adjusting the blanket around both of them. "When you've got nothing left, sometimes the only thing you can still give is kindness, and somehow, that always comes back to you." As if to prove her point, the door of the bookstore behind them opened with a gentle chime. An elderly man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses stepped out, locking the door behind him. He was about to walk away when he noticed the 2 figures sharing the blanket on his steps. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been Irish. "Are you both all right out here?" Sarah looked up at him with a characteristic gentle smile. "We're fine, sir. Just keeping each other warm." The man, whose name tag read Thomas, looked at them both for a long moment. Something in his expression softened. "I own this bookstore," he said, "and I have a small apartment upstairs. The heat's been acting up, making it too warm for me to sleep comfortably. Would you two mind doing me a favor and keeping an eye on the place tonight? There's a sofa and a spare bedroom up there that could use some occupying." David and Sarah exchanged glances. The offer seemed too good to be true, yet Thomas's eyes held the same genuine kindness that Sarah had shown. "We don't want to impose," David began. "Nonsense," Thomas said, already pulling out a key. "I could use the help anyway. Been worried about leaving the place empty overnight with all these break-ins happening downtown. You'd actually be doing me a service." An hour later, David found himself in a small but warm apartment above the bookstore, sharing a simple dinner of soup and bread with Sarah and Thomas. The old man told them stories of his years running the shop, and Sarah shared tales of the interesting people she had met during her time on the streets. As the evening wore on, David realized something had shifted inside him. The crushing weight of despair that had sat on his chest for months felt lighter. Not because his problems had disappeared, he still needed a job, still needed a permanent place to live, but because he was reminded that he wasn't alone in the world. When Thomas excused himself to return to his own home, he left them with blankets, pillows, and a promise that they could stay as long as they needed while they got back on their feet. He also mentioned that he had been looking for help in the bookstore, if either of them was interested. That night, as David settled onto the comfortable sofa and listened to the gentle sounds of Sarah preparing for bed in the spare room, he thought about the chain of kindness that had led them here. It had started with a young woman who had nothing but was willing to share half of it with a stranger. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Maple Street, but inside the little apartment above, the bookstore, two people who had been lost had found something precious: hope, warmth, and the reminder that, even in the darkest times, human compassion could light the way forward. The next morning would bring new challenges, new conversations with Thomas about working in the bookstore, and new possibilities for both David and Sarah. But tonight, they were safe, warm, and no longer alone. Sometimes, David thought as he drifted off to sleep, that was more than enough. Sometimes, that was everything.